Hello everyone, it's Casey Vineyard here with Wonders of Wildlife National Museum and Aquarium. We are so excited to have you here as we talk about our mission for the month of June through Mission Conservation, pollinators. This will be our last live stream for the month of June. So did you know pollinators are super important to our ecosystem? Think of all of your favorite foods. Some of you say vegetables, some of you may say chocolate. These are all thanks to our pollinator friends. So throughout the month of June, you'll get to meet multiple partners, and you have met multiple partners to learn super exciting facts about pollinators. Get ready to dive into some more fun facts about our pollinator friends and the importance to our ecosystem. In order to play this really fun mission, all you have to do is buzz on over to our mission conservation page at www.wondersofwildlife.org/mission-conservation, and that will bring you to our mission conservation webpage. So on this website, I'll bring your attention down to get the app. Once you click download, that'll take you to download the Agents of Discovery app, which you will need to play any mission conservation mission. Once you have that app downloaded, create a user account and log in. Hit the search bar, type in mission conservation, and this is where we house all of our at-home missions, and they will pop up for you to play. Once you have the mission popped up and loaded, hit play and get ready for your fun adventure. So if you're looking for more pollinator-related activities, we're going to direct you down to another part of our website where it says Schedule of Missions and Activities. And so this will show you our activity guide that we have for you to play at home. So there will be a fun craft, an awesome outdoor activity, and something that you can do to promote conservation for these amazing pollinators. So I'm currently standing here in our John A. and Jenny Morris Conservation Center. You can see a very bright yellow colored bush behind me. It's called Bushy St. John's wort. So you might, if you look very closely, you might be able to see a honeybee or maybe even a bumblebee. And that brings me to our partner for the day. We have Patrick with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He is here to talk about pollination in different prairies. So how are you doing today, Patrick?
Thank you. So very happy to be joining you all here today. As Casey mentioned, my name is Patrick Bryant, and I am a park ranger with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Where I'm joining you from today is the lovely Neal Smith National Wildlife Refuge. And I am excited to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is pollinators. And today we're going to be discussing a pollinator that calls Neal Smith home, the regal fritillary butterfly. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what it needs to survive because it has some unique needs and how the prairie is so essential to its survival. This is going to be about 25-ish minutes. We'll have some time at the end for questions, but feel free to drop anything in the chat, and Aaron, who's holding the camera for me, can kind of monitor that, and Casey as well. So before we get into the regal fritillary, I want to talk more about this lovely stuff that we're seeing behind me. So if you've been watching the pollinator series, you may have come across some other wildlife refuges. And I want to stress that we are part of a national wildlife refuge system. So it's not just one refuge, there are many located all across the country. And there's at least one in every state, and Iowa is just one of the many wonderful ones you can encounter. And what makes us so unique is the lovely tallgrass prairie that you're seeing behind me. And from some of the sounds you might even be hearing, you might be seeing that this is an excellent ecosystem for wildlife, pollinators in particular. And that has to do with some of the plants that you're seeing around me. So most of us are familiar with like lawn grasses, turf grass, the really short grasses we have in our yards or in parks. Well, this is probably very different grass from what you're used to because, as you can see, some of these stems are taller than I am. So tallgrass prairie is dominated by very tall grasses and wildflowers that provide the food, water, and shelter for lots of different wildlife to the Midwest. And aside from also being taller than what we're usually used to, they also have extremely deep roots. So your typical lawn grass probably only has couple of inches of roots. Well, the prairie grasses, for every foot you see above ground, probably have 2 or more feet growing below ground. So even taller than I am, you could have some prairie grasses, me stacked on top of me. That's how deep their roots go, which is really cool. And one thing that's really important about it is it has a lot to do with the history of tallgrass prairie in my state, Iowa. So if we take a look at Iowa pre-European settlement, which I luckily have a map right over here, Iowa is almost completely a prairie state. So all this lovely green you're seeing is what Iowa would have looked like pre-European settlement, early 1800s, 1830s. Well, what the settlers found is that those really deep prairie roots made for excellent soil. So really fertile soil that was good for growing things. And so Iowa was an excellent place to start a farm, and it has a lot to do with our history of agriculture. So if you fast forward 200 years, this map looks very different because so much of the prairie was converted to farmland. Now, more than 80% of the state of Iowa was prairie pre-European settlement. And I'm wondering if anyone can guess how much of that 80% remains today. So go ahead, drop that in the chat. Place your guesses now. I'm going to show you a map of what present day Iowa looks like, and I think you'll see that it's very different. So fast forward almost 200 years, and all of a sudden our beautiful, lush green map turns into this kind of blank white one, where there's only a few small patches of green prairie. So the vast majority of Iowa's prairie was turned either into agricultural land or taken away for development for human purposes. So if anyone was guessing, the number you were looking for was 1/10 of 1%. So 0.1, or excuse me, yeah. So massive change, massive change. So if you imagine you're one of the bees that are buzzing around us, or you're a bird that lives on the prairie, or you're our regal fritillary friend, you might be in trouble because the prairie is really important to what you need to survive. So let's go back to our regal fritillary. When we talk about butterflies, it's usually helpful to talk about not only the adult butterfly, but also the caterpillar and what it needs. So our regal fritillary is this nice little spiky guy. And one thing that he needs to survive is what's called a host plant. Now, most of us are probably familiar with host plants, even if it's not a term that we're used to hearing. And I've got a great example of a host plant right here next to me, actually. So these lovely plants here are what's called common milkweed. So it's got this nice, lovely pink cluster of flowers, and it's got these big leaves where if I broke it, there would be a milky sap on the inside. Now, this is the only thing that monarch caterpillars can eat is milkweed. So it's their host plant. Well, our friend, the regal fritillary, also has a host plant, and it is this gorgeous plant right here. So this is a violet. So like the violets you could get at a nursery, a garden store that you'd see in a garden. But this is a specific kind that grows on the prairie, and it's called prairie violet, fittingly. So I'd show you in our prairie, but while most prairie plants are very tall, prairie violet's only about 6 inches, maybe a foot when it's full grown. So we'd be bushwhacking to find it. So I figured a picture would work. But what sets prairie violet apart is that it has these kind of feathery leaves that kind of look like a hand. So most violets will have heart-shaped leaves. So say I was looking for our monarch butterfly eggs, because this is their host plant. All I would have to do is lift up the undersides of these leaves and look for eggs. But if I tried to do that for our regal fritillary, I could lift up these prairie violet leaves all day and I might never find an egg. That doesn't mean that it's not here. The the regal fritillary doesn't necessarily lay its eggs on the prairie violet. It can lay it on any number of plants, but it still needs this in order for the caterpillars to eat. So not only do you need these prairie violets, you need a whole lot of prairie and lots of different plants as well. So you might be thinking, man, you went from 80% to only 1/10%, and you need all these things. You're not going to have a good chance of survival. And that was one of the issues that was plaguing regal fritillary. Its population was really in decline, and we were worried about it. But it's also one of the beauties on why Neal Smith National Wildlife Refuge was created, because we are what's called a reconstructed prairie. What does that mean? Well, just like you could take a part of your yard and turn it into a vegetable garden, you can do the same thing with prairie. And that's what we did in the early 90s, is we reconstructed tallgrass prairie on a large scale to help pollinators like our regal fritillary friend. So I'm going to walk you through the steps on how we did that and how you at home can do some simple things to help pollinators like the regal fritillary. Now, pretend you're going to start a garden. Most people would probably go to a nursery, might get some starter plants, or you could get some seeds. Well, it's a little difficult to do that if you're going for prairie. Not a lot of places sell prairie plants, and if they do, they're usually in high demand. So where are you going to get seeds or starter plants? Give you a hint, right behind me. One of the things that we did when we first started Neal Smith is we went to those small pockets of prairie that still remained in the state of Iowa, and we collected seed by hand. Very meticulous, very time consuming, but one of the best ways to get seed, especially for specific types of plants. So I mentioned the Prairie Violet earlier. We're going to follow its journey through this prairie reconstruction and use it as an example. And I've got a picture of its seeds right here. And please excuse the water droplets. It's raining off and on here today. So Prairie Violet has this little droopy pod when it has seeds. And you might notice this strange kind of triangular, weird three-prong thing here. So Prairie Violets have what's called explosive seed dispersal. So this little droopy thing here will actually get so tightly wound and dried out that it will burst open into those 3 points and eject the seed several feet, which is a pretty impressive feat when you're only 6 inches tall. And it's a great way to disperse your seed and get it far away so it has a better chance of spreading. So this makes Prairie Violet really hard to collect, because if you come too early, seed's not ripe, you can't collect it yet. But if you wait too long, you'll come to this weird triangular thing and it might be empty from seeds. They might have shot on the ground already. So that can be really challenging, but it's how we can get Prairie Violet seed, is by actually going out and physically picking it. And then we also use a lot of volunteer help and staff help to physically remove the seeds from this pod, because we don't need the pod. That's not going to grow. We just want that pure seed. So let's say we did that. We went and got our seed. What's our next step? There's a couple different things you can do with prairie seed. So unlike a lot of plants where you actually have to physically bury it underground to get it to germinate, prairie seed, you can broadcast it, and so long as it is touching the surface of the soil, it can start to grow. Now, usually there's a period where you need a cold, warm period to get it to work, but that's a whole nother issue. So we could go out, spread the Prairie Violet seed, and it would start to grow, but that could be pretty iffy. The reasons being, it's really light, so it could easily blow away from where we want it. And it's a seed, so it's a food source for things like birds, insects. And as much as we want to help them, that's the whole reason we're doing this, maybe we want to get a plant first and have that produce seeds for them. So we like to give our seeds a fighting chance and give them a start in our greenhouse. So that brings us to our next step. After collecting seed, we will grow seedlings. And I've got an example of what we grow our seedlings in. So this probably looks different from a regular pot that you would think about growing plants in. It's really shallow. It's only about 2 inches deep, and it's really wide. Now, the reason we have this is because this is a temporary home for our seedlings. We only want our seeds to be in here a couple of weeks until they get their first true leaves. So it's going to look something like this when it is grown after 2 weeks. Now you might be thinking, wow, those seeds are really tightly packed in there. And you're absolutely correct. So all we do is we scatter a bunch of seeds on the surface. We don't really worry too much about spacing because they're not going to be in here very long. Because once those 2-ish weeks are up, after watering and making sure they have enough sun, the roots will be, whoop, nice grab, Patrick. We'll be down at the bottom and we'll be ready to transplant our seeds because they need more space if they're to keep growing. So seed collection, growing the seedlings in these trays. And I should say the seed collection typically happens in fall once most of the prairie flowers have died and they have produced seed. And then this section here with the green trays would be in late February, maybe into March. So think late winter. And that brings us to our next stage, which is transplanting into containers, or to give it a better name, containers. You might be thinking containers, that's a terrible pun. I know it's a terrible pun, but work with me. These yellow containers are where we're going to move our seedlings, and they are fittingly called containers because they're the shape of a cone. You might be thinking, well, that's a strange shape to be growing something in, and you'd be correct, but there is some logic to this. And one of the reasons is we go back to our prairie roots, in that it doesn't matter so much what's growing above ground, we care more about what's happening down here in the roots. Because when we eventually plant this outside, we want to make sure it has the strongest roots possible so that it has the best chance of surviving. So what we'll do with these containers is we will fill them with soil. I've got one example here. And then we'll use a highly specialized tool called a pencil in order to help us transplant. So we would take our little seedling tray, gently dig up the seedlings, take one example and put it in here using our pencil to dig a little hole. And then that's about all there is to it with the planting. It takes a very long time, and we have lovely volunteers and school groups who help us do this. And we will fill up these trays one by one. So there's about 98 of these cones in here. So I'll figure just about 100. And we do thousands of these at a time. We don't have any plants to show right now. We didn't plant much this year due to COVID, but if you were to look in our greenhouse, we could have upwards of 30,000 of these at a time, which can get really crazy. So they will stay in these containers for several weeks to a couple months, depending on the species. So you figure if we planted our Prairie Violet seedlings in, say, March, maybe we'll be able to do something with them. They'll be mature enough. We'll say June. Now, how do you know when they're mature enough? Remember, I said the stuff that you see above doesn't matter as much as what you see below. So let's see if I can find my dirt one again. What we're looking for is we're going to squeeze our cone. And we're looking for it to be nice and firm. So you can see there's nothing growing in here. It's real easy to squeeze. But when the plant has fully grown roots down, remember those prairie roots are really strong. So this is actually going to feel really firm. And if I were to pop this plant out, it would hold the soil together. So I wouldn't even have to worry about it spilling out. Kind of looks like a weird black carrot. So really cool. And that's how we know the plant has what it needs in order to survive. And once they've reached that point, so say it's about June, which it is June right now, we would be ready to plant outside. And we'd find an area. Typically, we wouldn't do an acreage this way where it's just dirt and we're starting anew. Usually, we use this method when we want to add variety. So say I wanted to add more prairie violets to the garden that's behind me. We could do that using this method. But this is a lot of plants. This is 98, and I said we do thousands at a time. So you want to be as efficient as possible while you're doing this. And one way that we do that is by using another specialized tool. Okay, this one's a little more specialized than the last, called a dibble. So this weird spear-looking thing is actually specifically designed to work with our containers. So the observant among you might notice that these are the exact same size. And so what that means is, if you can picture going out into a garden to plant something, usually you'll get a shovel, you'll dig a hole with a little trowel, put in your plant, and then fill in the excess with soil. We don't want to have to do that. That's a lot of bending down and having to fill in with extra soil. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a hole that's the exact same size as our containers. Pretty smart. And you use this dibble the same way you would use a shovel. It's got a little step here. So all you have to do is find an area in the prairie where you want to put these, step on this and slowly work it down, and then you'll have a perfectly sized hole. And like I mentioned, these containers, you would simply invert them and they're not going to fall out. So you tap them on the edge, your plant would slide out gently, and again, it would look like a nice black carrot. Pops right in the hole. You can gently tuck it in. That's what I tell students is put your plant to bed, read it a nice story, and then you're ready to move on to the next one. So you might be thinking, wow, this is a long process just to get one prairie violet. And you're absolutely right. It's a lot of work, and a lot of staff, volunteer time, wonderful students put into doing this process. And it takes a while too. That prairie seed we collected in fall isn't going to be planted out onto the prairie using this method until summer. So I don't want you to get discouraged though. You might be thinking, that's far too much work for me. I'm sorry, Regal Fritillary, I can't help, but you can. And there's some very simple things you can take from this that you can use in your own home to help pollinators like the Regal Fritillary. And the first and foremost is plant native. So what does that mean? Well, native is a term used to talk about a plant that is found in a particular area. So these plants you're seeing behind me, the prairie grasses and flowers, are native to the area. So they would naturally grow here. A lot of the times we're used to planting things that we find in a nursery that might not be from, like in my case, Iowa. Maybe it's something that was from South America originally and looks really pretty, but maybe it only blooms for a little time, or it's not really made for growing in Iowa. Well, when you plant natives, just like we have favorite foods, so too do pollinators like our Regal Fritillary. So if we can plant the foods that they've evolved with over thousands of years, it makes it a little bit easier for them to use them and find a food source. So kind of think of it like I could hand you a plate of something that looked like, I don't know, disgusting, awful. You didn't know what it was. I could tell you it's the best thing you've ever tasted, but if you don't know what it is and you don't know how to eat it, it's not going to be any useful to you. So plant native, plant host plants. So just like our milkweeds that you're seeing here, or our prairie violet that we've been talking about, making sure that pollinators have what they need to survive at all life stages is essential. So if you ever want to help a particular pollinator, maybe check and see if it needs a host plant or if it has a favorite plant that it likes. And then last but not least, make sure you have flowers blooming throughout the entire season. So our Regal Fritillary butterflies aren't going to start being active until June usually, but they don't actually go and lay their eggs until fall. So there's a long period in there where if they don't have any food or they don't have anything to do, they're not going to be able to survive. So we can't just have plants in May or June. We have to have them all throughout the growing season. And that's one of the benefits of prairie as well, is that it's got a lot of variety. And it would look completely different if you came here in, say, October, September. So 3 really simple things you could do to help pollinators like the Regal Fritillary. Plant native, plant host plants, and then I'm blanking on the last one. The beauty of doing live videos. Drop in the chat if you remember what our 3rd one was. Plants all year. Thank you, Aaron. Got a bit of that COVID brain. So hopefully you felt inspired to plant for native pollinators. Hopefully you've seen why places like Neal Smith and other wildlife refuges are so essential to all of the wildlife that we love. And with that, I'm going to kick it back to Casey.
Awesome, great. Well, Thank you so much for joining us today, Patrick. It was a pleasure to have you here to talk about these amazing pollinators and their jobs in the prairie, as well as the prairie plants and how to plant. Well, that is all the time that we have for this live stream, but join us next week as we do have an all new mission, forests. In the next month, you will get to learn things about rainforests, deciduous forests, animals that inhabit forests, and so much more. Well, thank you for joining us throughout this month to learn about pollinators. Remember, plant some trees, save some bees, and join us next week. Thank you.